Welcome back to the Hebrew Point of View. We are going and getting and diving straight into the book of Galatians, where we have been speaking about Paul. And do you want me to go ahead and read this verse?
Well, we read the first 5 verses. Go ahead and read the 6th verse.
Okay, so the 6th verse, and this is where I think things are quite interesting. 6th verse in the Amplified Bible, it says, I'm surprised and astonished that you are so quickly turning renegade and deserting him who invited and called you by the grace, unmerited favor of Christ the Messiah, and that you are transferring your allegiance to a different, even an opposition gospel. Not that there is or could be any other genuine gospel, but there are obviously some who are troubling and disturbing and bewildering you with a different kind of teaching which they offer as a gospel, and want to pervert and distort the gospel of Christ, the Messiah, into something which absolutely is not.
So that's the Amplified Bible, and they do it beautifully.
Yeah,
they really present it beautifully. You can understand what he's saying. He says, I'm so shocked that you so quickly turn renegade. So what are we talking about? If you haven't seen the part 3 of this, you need to go back and watch part 3, because we deal with this. But we're talking about those who came from Jerusalem, who were opposed to Paul's teaching, who held on to the old school thinking, and I say old school in quotation marks, that one had to become Jewish to be saved, to be part of the family, to be part of the covenant relationship that man has with God, the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And traditionally, you had to become Jewish, which meant what? When we know from our previous discussions, it meant to be circumcised and identified as a Jew, doing those things, those parts of the law that made you Jewish. Circumcision, sacrifice, and being baptized into Judaism, if you were a Gentile.
So how were they baptized into Judaism?
Well, baptism was a way that you went from one sect of Judaism to another. So let's say you wanted to join the Essenes, and you go to the Essenes. You say, "I believe in your message. It's a part of Judaism. Your explanation of Judaism and your representation is what I want." And they say, "Okay, you can join us." You get schooled in what they believe, and then you go through baptism, which is an indication that you've changed.
So this is the water baptism that we know.
Yes.
Okay.
But we this is a totally different thing. You get,
no, but I'm just saying,
you get ceremonial cleansing,
right.
and you get this movement.
But this is
from
not something
one
we don't
sect to
know
another.
about. We understand baptism.
Yeah.
Right.
So when you go to baptism, you go under the water, and when you come out as a newborn. In other words,
believing
all your old belief system is washed away, and you're ready to start something new.
Interesting. Okay.
So that's baptism, but we can do that later.
Okay.
But what we have here is these people coming to Pisidium Antioch after Paul has left, and they are teaching them, saying, don't listen to what Paul said, don't believe what Paul said. You have to be circumcised, you have to become Jewish.
They're not going to let go
and
of
Paul hears about this, and he writes to the church, in other words, all those believers in Galatia, in Pisidium Antioch. He says, I'm shocked that you so quickly have turned away from the message that I preached. And you are listening to another gospel. Not that there is another gospel, he says, but what these people have done is they're just distorting it. And why did they feel they had the right to distort it? Because for years, for centuries, they had believed that they had the right to change the way Torah was interpreted. And we have the Ma'asim, those traditions that they do over and over again, eventually become Torah, become law. And we have the Takanot, those modifications that they make so that they can regulate life in Israel. So these people feel they have the right to do that. They're coming behind Paul and they start to change what he taught. And Paul says, no, I'm so disappointed that you've just given up on the message that I preached, the gospel that I preached. I want to read also again from this book on Galatians, a Torah-based commentary on the first century Hebraic context by Avi ben Mordechai. And it's a book on Galatians, and I'm going to read to you what he says here about the Pharisees. Now, listen to this. This is written by someone who comes out of a Jewish background, and he's writing to Christians, and he's writing to believers and to Messianics. He says here, as the Pharisees understood things, their laws, their enactments, and their traditions, their ma'asim and takanot, took precedence over the written commandments, and consequently, Pharisaic teachings had to be obeyed. If the converting Goyim, the Gentiles, did not submit to the Pharisees, then in the eyes of the Pharisees, there could be no change of status for them. The Gentile would remain unclean. Today, most people would not know this because the term another gospel claims other associations. And unfortunately, when people read Galatians, and we've read a lot of commentaries that have said this, people think that Galatians cancels out the law, cancels Torah, sets you free, and salvation is by Jesus Christ only. And we can forget about the law, we can forget about Torah, we can forget about all those things because God has done away with that. Torah does
not. So.
Galatians does not teach that.
Right.
But anyway, let's move on. Today, most people would not know this, and therefore the term another gospel claims other associations. I think that most people who hold to an acceptance of Yeshua simply do not know Scripture. That's not my words, that's his words. Strongly believing that another gospel means obedience to the law of Moses. In other words, they believe that these people were coming to teach that salvation is by the law of Moses. And he's talking about the whole law. So when people read Galatians, they forget that he's talking about circumcision. How do we know it's talking about circumcision? Just go to the last chapter, read the last chapter, and you will find out when Paul summarizes and sums up his letter, he talks only about circumcision. That we did in part 2. So, it says here, in other words, if one wishes to keep the laws or the Old Testament and teaches others to do this, then this is contrary to the doctrine or the gospel of Jesus Christ. To a huge number of Christians and to some Messianics, Galatians is a crystal clear teaching that the New Testament is one's personal liberation from entanglement with the law or with the Mosaic law. They say that one's obedience to the law is a nullification of the work of Christ and thus rejecting the newness of spirit. However, Paul knew that the written commandment takes preeminence above everything. If one comes along and teaches something contrary to the written word, that is another gospel, which perverts the gospel of Yeshua. Today, another gospel not only applies to the halachic teachings of Orthodox Judaism, but also to customs that have come into the church.
And those customs are
pagan customs that have been accepted into the church. So another gospel is not a reference to people saying, okay, you're obeying Torah, that means you've rejected Jesus. No, we know that Galatians is not about that. We know Galatians is about circumcision. But what he's saying here is that another gospel must be interpreted as people taking things and changing things, and especially in the church today, we see traditions coming into the church which are pagan, of pagan origin, and they're assimilated into the church, and we have a syncretic kind of Christianity being or evolving, and that is another gospel.
Right.
And that's where we need to
very dangerous.
Think about it. That wasn't what Paul was talking about. Paul was referring to the Judaizers who were coming in and telling them you had to be circumcised to become a believer, to become part of the Ma'amanim.
So we don't. The Galatians doesn't really. He addresses them, but we don't really know how the people reacted.
Well, we do, because Paul had a great following, and all that they needed were these corrections, these teachings. Now we don't know that there was a big change either towards the Judaizers or towards Paul. No, we don't know that. You're quite right. But we do know that his letters got through. When we read the letter to the Ephesians, which a lot of people believe is a general letter to all the churches. We see he deals with other things there.
Okay, but let's talk about, seeing that we are talking about Galatians now. What is the main message that Paul is bringing to the church at Galatia?
The main message is you do not have to become Jewish to become part of the covenant that God has with mankind.
Okay.
You can do it without being circumcised,
Yeah.
without becoming Jewish. You can be a God-fearer.
Yeah.
You don't have to proselytize to Judaism.
What did they have to do though?
Well, that goes into further discussion on the Jerusalem Council, where they met and they said, okay, if these Gentiles are coming in, this is what they're going to do. We don't want to go there. What they had to do was believe in God, believe in Torah, believe and trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. How did they enter into this relationship? They came in through Yeshua.
Did they need to be baptized?
They didn't have to be baptized, but baptism was a natural progression
They
from
were used to that, right?
belief. Yes.
Yeah, they were accustomed to it.
And nobody questioned baptism.
Yeah.
Because no one was boasting in baptism. What they were boasting in is that sign in the flesh that you could demonstrate that you were Jewish, that it identified you as being Jewish, and that was circumcision. And that's the message of Galatians. So when Paul talks about the circumcised, and he often mentions there the circumcised and the uncircumcised, who's he talking about? The circumcised, he's talking about Jews and proselytes, but mostly Jews. If he talks about the circumcised, he's talking about those born Jewish. If he talks about the uncircumcised, he's talking about the Gentiles. Anyone who is a Gentile or a God-fearer who hasn't yet proselytized.
Okay, so if they have proselytized, then they obviously were circumcised. They felt the need.
Yes, and they were classed as a circumcised.
Yeah, but that still didn't really make them Jewish.
It did, because they essentially had done everything that it was required by God to be Jewish.
Okay.
But the question is not if it's right or wrong to be Jewish. The question was, do you have to be Jewish to enter into into covenant relationship with God?
Yeah.
And Paul says no.
No.
Abraham wasn't in that covenant relationship with God when he was accepted, when God made this covenant with him.
Right. There's no record of that.
Abraham and his household were only circumcised 10 years
Later,
after.
long time.
Yes.
He was old.
Isaac was already a young boy.
Yeah.
So the promise was Isaac.
Yeah.
And he believed the promise, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham was righteous before the law, before circumcision.
Yeah, very good.
And Paul says if it's good enough for Abraham, it's good enough for the Gentiles.
Right, exactly.
And that's the message.
Okay.
I want to talk about another thing quickly, and that is he mentions this present evil age. Now we're going to discuss this in more depth when we get to Ephesians. But what does it mean? You know, people take words like this and we run with all kinds of theological explanations and all kinds of messages, and you know, we talk about this evil age and it's controlled by the evil one, and you know, what is Paul talking about when he says this present evil age?
Okay, so the Amplified says wicked age. Same, really.
Yeah,
the same difference.
Wicked. It goes back to Isaiah 42, where God says, I am Jehovah. That is my name, and I won't share my glory with anyone, and I won't share my praise with anyone. Not with idols and graven images. And so, you know, throughout the law, throughout Torah, there's this teaching about idol worship. But these Gentiles, and even a lot of the Jews, were involved in idol worship.
Yeah.
Because it had got into their society.
Yeah.
They had brought it back from Babylon. It's
ingrained in them.
Yeah.
Totally.
Throughout their history, they are persecuted by God, and they are punished by God for erring towards idolatry.
Yeah.
But these Gentiles who were coming to the church came out of idolatry. That's all they knew.
Right.
And so a lot of them were holding on to some of the things that they used to do. Where did they used to worship these idols? On the high places.
Yes.
So, you know,
I mean, they had a God for everything.
Yep. They had a God for everything. That's why they couldn't understand monotheism.
Right.
How can you just have one God? Who's the God of the spring, and who's the God of the winter, and who's the God of fertility, and who's the God of war, and who's the God of peace, and who's going to protect you, and who's going to make your plants grow? You've got to have gods for everything.
Right.
And this is
they become accustomed to that.
But this is where they were. These Gentiles. This is what they believe.
Yeah.
You don't change a person's belief system just like that.
No.
These things are ingrained. It takes a lot of time to wean yourself from these pagan beliefs.
Yeah.
There's so many in the church today that hold on to pagan beliefs that they cannot release. And we won't go there.
To say.
But it's part of people. It's part of what
our
we
nature.
are and what we do. We don't want to release things because they're too precious. It's our little holy cow.
Yeah.
And these Gentiles were holding on to these pagan beliefs. And Paul is saying, no, you can't do that. When he writes to the Ephesians, he says that we're not struggling and battling only with flesh and blood, but we are battling against principalities and powers and spiritual wickedness in the high places. What are the high places? That's where they worship these pagan gods.
Exactly.
And they erected these Asherah, these
images,
obelisks on the high places to their gods.
Yeah.
So Paul is battling this, and when we get to Ephesians, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But also, it also refers to the government who was in power at the time, and we spoke about this last time. Remember what we said? Who was in power? The Romans. And what did the Romans demand? They demanded idol worship. They demanded emperor worship. So everyone, every week, had to come to the statue of the head of the emperor and burn incense and bring an offering and bow down to the statue of the emperor. It was emperor worship. However, if you were Jewish, you didn't have to do it. And that's what some of the Judaizers were saying. Just get circumcised, that you don't have to worry, you won't be persecuted.
Yeah.
But this is the age that Paul is talking about. We're in this age controlled by Romans.
This is the era that we need to understand.
Forced into pagan worship and idolatry when it comes to the emperor worship.
So this was influencing their whole mindset.
Absolutely. And Paul says this is one of the things that we are also having to deal with in this wicked age.
Yeah. And it's prevalent in today's church as well.
Yeah. In part of Galatians 2, Paul mentions the poor. When he goes to the disciples and he eventually presents himself and his gospel to them with Barnabas and with Titus, they eventually say, okay, we accept the fact that this is of God. We see the Holy Spirit poured into the lives of these Gentiles, especially of Titus, who was there with them, who was a Gentile. And Paul and Barnabas took him to Jerusalem to show what God is doing. So eventually they say, okay, we accept you, we send you out, and they become apostles now to the elders in Jerusalem, shaliach, those who go out with a special message with the authority of the elders in Jerusalem. But he says to them, but do not forget the poor. So again, theologies have been developed around this statement. Don't forget the poor. Now Jesus did preach to take care of the poor, the widows and the orphans. It was tzedakah, this giving, this giving in faith, this righteous acts of righteousness. But what are they referring to here is that's important to us. When Paul talks about the poor, the evionim, he's talking about those in Jerusalem, the believers in Jerusalem. Now this may come as a shock, and this you may not know, but the believers in Jerusalem are called the Evionim. Why? Because there was a guy by the name of Agabus, and he came out and he prophesied. He said there's going to be a devastating drought that's going to sweep through the country. And in fact, it did happen. It happened during the reign of Claudius Caesar. I think probably 41 to 56 the current era, thereabouts. So in this time, there was this drought. And so why were the believers in Jerusalem called the Evyonim, the poor? Because they had this practice of selling everything we have, and we distribute it amongst everybody, which was a great thing as far as loving each other. People used to say, see how they love one another. They distribute their goods between everybody. However, it's made them
poor,
unable to withstand a drought, withstand this famine that was coming upon them.
Because they'd given everything away.
They'd given everything away. And so Peter says, or James says to Paul, you fine, but you go back and you tell the people in Presidium Antioch, do not forget us in Jerusalem. When this famine hits, we are going to be hardest hit. Paul and Barnabas had known about this prophecy. When they went to Jerusalem, if you read Galatians, they actually took monetary gifts with them. They took an offering before they left, and they took the money with them to Jerusalem. I guess it was twofold. One of them to just say, look, this is how much we care, but also because they understood about the famine. So when Paul talks here about, or when Peter and James say, don't forget the poor, he's not saying just go and be generous to everybody in the world. He's saying, don't forget us here in Jerusalem, because the famine's coming and we are poorly equipped to see it through.
And that's Galatians 2 verse 10.
Yeah. So that's really interesting.
Okay, so that scripture was in Galatians 2 verse 10. They only made one stipulation, and this is Paul and Barnabas, that we were to remember the poor, which very thing I was also eager to do. But when Peter came to Antioch, I protested and opposed him to his face concerning his conduct there, for he was blamable and stood condemned. For up to the time that certain person came from James, he ate his meals with the Gentiles. And this was another whole thing.
Yeah. So
they didn't like him to do.
This was the fight between Peter and Paul, where Paul rebukes Peter and he calls him a hypocrite.
Yeah.
Why? Because when Peter first came to Antioch, he was friends with everybody, eating with the Gentiles, praying with the Gentiles, teaching the Gentiles, fellowshipping with them. And then certain men come from Jerusalem, and Peter says, what are they going to think of me mixing with these Gentiles? And so Peter withdraws, and he takes Barnabas with him. And Paul comes in and he rebukes Peter. He says, you're a hypocrite. If I had to do what you are doing, I would build up everything that I've already broken down. And what had he just broken down? He'd broken down the barriers that had been imposed upon the Gentiles to have to be circumcised to become Jewish. So when Paul says later on, he says, and God has made of all men, both Jew and Gentile, and made us one new man. What is he saying? He said, he's broken down everything, the barriers, and we can all together worship God and be part of the family, be part of this covenant relationship with God without the barriers of Judaism. So folks, we have more to talk about, but for right now I think we have gone on long enough. I hope this is helping. I hope this is equipping you. It's certainly enlightening, and to
get more out of this, we're doing the studying, we're doing the research and all that. So all you need to do is just stay tuned.
Just listen and just please share this with other people.
Yeah.
You know what? It's so important that people get to understand some of the stuff, and I'm having fun doing it, and I'm having fun researching and reading. But we can do all we want, but if people don't hear it,
what's the purpose?
It's really it's going nowhere. So please help us to share this with people on your social media. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please subscribe to our channel. We have another exciting announcement to make, and then this book that Dr. Blizzard wrote, A Hebrew Understanding of the Difficult Passages in the Bible. Some of the things he writes about, let me just read you a couple. The kingdom of heaven. What is the kingdom of heaven? Thou shalt not kill. Did God actually say thou shalt not kill? How do you commit adultery in your heart? Do not swear or do not take an oath. What does that mean? The measure with which you give, what is that? So much in this book. But the exciting part is now that you can go onto getourbooks.com and you can download this onto your computer, and you can transfer it into a Kindle document and read it on your Kindle for only $9.99.
Yeah.
So available to you right now. You can go right now and download it. Anybody, anywhere in the world can now download this book and be blessed by what he writes there.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll get all the rest of our material up digitally, and you can do the same.
Yeah, we're working on getting our stuff up there, but right now that's available. Take advantage of it. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for supporting us at the Hebrew Point of View.
God bless you.